I'll start by saying that I'm not an economist. So I'm going to talk to you about the economy, but I'm not an economist. And I think that's quite important because we tend to shy away from that debate because we think that the experts have got the answers. But actually, an economy affects us all. And we all need to be part of that conversation. And that includes all of you. So you don't need to be an economist to do this. And what I'm going to do today is take you through 6 critiques of our current economic model, economic growth, effectively, and the kind of more narrow definition of that. I'll go through each of those. But before I do that, I want to ask you a question. So what do you think is the purpose of an economy? Anyone?
To get people at the top richer.
Some people would agree entirely with that statement. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it should be well-being.
Well-being.
Food, warmth and shelter.
Food, warmth and shelter, yes. Any more?
To facilitate things happening and
To
being able to do things.
To enable what? Transactions?
Yes,
Yeah.
work, so.
Okay, yeah. Any-
Circulate resources evenly.
To circulate resources evenly, yeah. Sorry?
If only.
If only, exactly. It's the evenly bit that's missing usually, isn't it? Sorry?
Exchange of goods.
Yes, and that's a kind of a quite established definition within economics. It's about effectively enabling the exchange of goods. The allocation of scarce resources is another way that's put. I would say that the only real purpose of an economy, and it's kind of been mentioned already, is to deliver well-being within planetary boundaries. To enhance the well-being and happiness of people and do so in a way that doesn't destroy nature in the process and actually keeps us in a safe space and a safe planet. So with that in mind, there are some issues with the way we currently do things. And I'm going to start with the first one, which is about privileging financial capital. So this is an image that kind of represents financial capital at the top. And then everything that feeds into financial capital starts with nature, natural capital, human capital, people, skills, knowledge. Social capital, our interactions, our institutions that enable us to do things together, which then creates manufactured capital, goods and services, which we sell for financial capital, right? So the goal, everything points towards financial capital. The truth is that if you look at this graph in a different way, what you see is that financial capital is only possible with all of the other capitals involved. So it's only possible to produce goods if we have access to resources, if we have access to energy. And those things make that we are entirely dependent on natural, social and human capital to actually produce financial capital. But the way that the economy is being run today, it says whatever it takes to get financial capital, that's what we'll do, even if it erodes the other things. And as I'm sure you know, and we will talk a little bit more today, we are eroding all of the others. We're living well in extent beyond the capacity of the planet to cope with our use of it. We are eroding human well-being, both in Western countries and in developed nations. We're not really protecting these things that are so critical to achieve financial capital, assuming that that's what we wanted to achieve. The other problem with our economic model is it effectively disregards both the material and the social dimensions of the economy. So what you see here, I don't expect you to read this from a distance, but this is the chart that shows population growth. So up until the kind of mid-1800s, there were about 1 billion people on the planet. We're now up to 8 billion, very recently past 8 billion people. And that growth is exponential. You see that it's been very, very flat. That 1 billion figure, and very slowly we got to 1 billion. And then with the Industrial Revolution, and therefore access to more productivity, more food, more energy, which help people live longer, we have now extended that way beyond the carrying capacity of the Earth. And that shows in the other graphs. So this is a graph that says water use. This is about fertilizer consumption. This is about the ocean ecosystems and pressures on the ecosystem. This is the depletion of ozone. So all of these things are impacted by that figure. But not only it's not just the population growth, it's the population married to the impact that we're having because of the fact that we are constantly trying to deliver more stuff in order to meet the growth imperative. Now we'll get to in a minute as to why it's important to deliver the growth imperative, or it's deemed to be important. But that's really, you can see there's a very strong correlation between us as our species and all of the impacts that we're having on the planet. a fantastic woman called Kate Raworth came up with the concept of donut economics. And she wrote a book, which is this one. She effectively brought together two concepts. One is the idea of planetary boundaries. We cannot exceed certain planetary thresholds if we want to maintain a safe space to live in on the planet, right? Climate change is a very important one. If we're significantly altering weather patterns and heating the planet, really bad things are going to happen, and we're seeing that already. But there are lots of others. And that's all based on the work of a number of scientists, initially started with the Stockholm Resilience Institute, and they looked at what are these boundaries that we can't exceed. And so I'll read them out to you because you probably can't see them all. So there's climate change, ocean acidification, which leads to, for instance, the bleaching of corals, chemical pollution in all of our natural spaces, nitrogen phosphorus loading, so that's a lot to do with agriculture and the runoffs of agricultural pesticides and fertilizers. Freshwater withdrawals, we're using more and more water for industrial production, meaning less and less is accessible for human consumption. Land conversion, so very topical around here, using natural land and building on top of it. Biodiversity loss, so in case you probably know this, but we are at the greatest rate of extinction of species since the dinosaurs went. We're calling it the sixth greatest extinction. And on top of that, we have since 1970 lost 66% of mammals, birds, amphibians, and reptiles on the planet. So 2/3 of all animals that existed in terms of numbers in 1970 have now gone, entirely due to human activity, and entirely due to the human activity that exists in order to deliver that growth that we're going to talk about. Air pollution and ozone layer depletion. So those are the environmental ceiling that we do not want to exceed. And we're already exceeding it in a number of different dimensions. In fact, in most of them. Now, there's a line to that. And Kate, when she saw that first piece of work, the scientific piece of work, she was working at Oxfam, very much involved with kind of, alleviating poverty and social issues. And she said, that's great. Okay, let's keep within these environmental thresholds. But what happens if we do that at the expense of people? Surely that can't be right. And so she kind of came up with this idea of creating a social foundation, a level of human well-being below which we could not fall to meet basic human needs. And that came out of the work that was done ahead of the Rio +20 conference in 2012, where lots of different countries, cities and regions across the world said, these are the things that we need to keep our people in a decent state of living. So access to water, to food, to health, energy, creating networks, having housing, gender equality, social equity, having a political voice, peace and justice, income and work. So these are all the ones below which we should not fall. We should not go beyond this threshold. And so this space here is what she called the donut, the safe and just space for humanity. And that kind of tells you a lot about, our current model is impinging in all of those. Our pursuit of growth is impinging in all of those. And it's really important that we consider that when we think about the consequences of growth. Now, let me go back to why we are so obsessed with growth. And that kind of started after the Second World War. So after the Second World War, we developed this indicator, GDP, gross domestic product. And it was meant to be a proxy for progress. And of course, after the Second World War, there was a lot of need for economic growth for the simple reason that our economies had been so hard hit by the consequences of the war that there was a need to get out of that. And still today, if you look at the poorest nation in the world, there is a very strong correlation between economic growth and poverty alleviation. So in the poorest countries of the world, that is actually a good thing to focus on economic growth. In our nations, in the wealthier nations, and even in the not extremely poor nations, that doesn't apply anymore. So why are we still using GDP as a measure? It's really because it was the only game in town back in the 50s. It reminds me of a story that someone once told about a man in a kind of under a light at night, looking for, a drunk man kind of staggering around looking for something. And a policeman drops by and says, "Excuse me, sir, can I help you? What are you looking for?" "I've lost my keys. I don't know where they are. I can't get home." "Okay, I'll look for them with you." So there they are, 10 minutes looking for these keys. After 10 minutes, no keys. So the policeman says, "Are you sure you lost them here?" And the guy says, No, I lost them over there." "Well, why are we looking here then?" "Because this is where the light is." And that's what we're doing. GDP has been for many years the only indicator we use to measure human progress. So we kind of become stuck with it. And we look at it as the only game in town. And that's a big flaw in the system as well. Now, the other problem with our economic model is that it increases inequality. This is a chart that shows inequality in the UK, US, Canada, and Australia. So very similar kind of lines. And back in the early parts of the 20th century, there was high levels of inequality. Part of that is also what led to some of the, you know, the disruption, if you want, in the first part of the 20th century. And then after the war, with a lot of investment that came, public investment that came into institutions like the NHS, into infrastructure, energy, transport, etc., into education, levels of inequality dropped quite significantly. You know, things became better for many more people. And then in the 1980s, that changed, and we're reverting back now to the levels that we saw 100 years ago. Now, who can guess what happened in the 1980s? Thatcher, Reagan, neoliberalism. Very much policies that were meant to effectively kind of say, let's not intervene, let's not, you know, those who haven't got, that's their problem. It's not our responsibility. So minimum intervention of state, etc., etc. French economist Thomas Piketty, who's a kind of economist and historian, wrote a book called Capital in the 21st Century, and he basically made the direct link between this idea of the growing inequality and its link to the focus on economic growth. Or more explicitly, focus on wealth. So what he said was that in capitalist societies, what you get is people who have access to wealth, who have private wealth, who aren't reliant on the economy, in other words, salaries for their financial well-being, they have more choices. It's like going to a casino and playing roulette, and instead of having one chip that you can put on one number, you've got 40 chips you can put on every number. You're bound to win because you've got a lot more options to win, right? And so the challenge is therefore that those that are wealthy are accumulating their wealth, while the rest of us are entirely dependent on the economy to increase our salaries and to keep things above or below the cost of inflation, and to try and manage that dynamic. And that shows itself very strongly in this chart here. So this is since the financial crash, which affected everyone. But clearly what you can see is that the top 1% have been doing absolutely fine since the financial crash. Initially, they struggled a bit more, but they've done it because they've got that wealth to invest, to put in different options that they want to. And as a result of that, to continue growing it. The bottom 50% have done far less well. So it's really embedded in the system. Now, why does inequality matter anyway? This is some work, some of you may be familiar with this, called the spirit level, which was done by two academics, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. And what they looked at the correlation between inequality and certain indicators of societal well-being or ill-being. So these are the indicators here. Low life expectancy, low math and literacy, high infant mortality, high crime rates, high mental health challenges, low trust in each other and society, low social mobility. All of these things you can see here, these are OECD countries, so wealthier countries. And this applies more to wealthy countries, as I said at the beginning. Very strong correlation. If you have high levels of inequality, you have high levels of health and social problems. The USA being a prime example of that. Very unequal society. You know, yes, you have a lot of money, but you have a lot of people who live well below, you know, a poverty line for that particular country. Now, some people argue there's nothing to do with inequality, these challenges here. It's all to do with access to money, GDP per capita. Well, they did that research as well and showed that there was no correlation at all. So this is the same graph on this side, but here it's national income per person, or GDP per capita, completely scattered. So there is no correlation. It's not, so economic growth does not drive better social outcomes according to this. Income inequality or reduction of income inequality does. Let me show you a little video in the hope that the sound will work.
From birth to puberty, a hamster doubles its weight each week. If it didn't stop when mature, as animals do, and continue to double, on its first birthday, we would be staring at a 9 billion ton hamster. This hamster could eat all of the corn produced annually worldwide in a single day and still be hungry. There is a reason why In nature, things grow in size only to a certain point. So why do most economists and politicians think that the economy can grow forever and ever and ever?
So David Attenborough paraphrased a US economist called Kenneth Boulding very well when he says, you've got to be a madman or an economist to think you can achieve infinite growth within a finite system. We only have one planet. It's not going to get any bigger. So why is everything that we do kind of almost validated by the idea that growth can continue happening, including our pensions? We want to believe that as long as we keep putting money into our pensions, that money will grow. And our financial advisors promise us they will grow by X%. And if you invest wisely, it might even grow by X plus 5%. But logic says at some point that's going to crash, right? There's just no logic that justifies that unless we have a completely dematerial society. So we don't use any resources on the planet and somehow still achieve economic growth. I'll get to that in a bit. In fact, I'll get to that now. So this looks at the idea that we can have a fully green economy, a fully dematerialized green economy where we are able to cut CO2 emissions to net zero by 2050. I'm sure you've heard of that target. That's the goal, right? Now, this is where we are today. So this is population growth, the blue line. This is GDP. And as you can see, GDP and CO2 emissions are very closely aligned, have been throughout that period. And currently we're up here, and apart from this little blip here, which is the pandemic, nothing's really changed, right? We keep going up and up and up. Yet we're saying that we can do this. I mean, it just completely escapes logic to think that that is possible. Yes?
When you say we are saying that, who's actually saying it?
Well, the advocates, anyone who defends the idea of net zero by 2050, effectively. So, the COP process is all geared towards achieving net zero by 2050, and everyone signs up to these wonderful promises that they're going to deliver that. And you could make an argument that says if we're just good enough at switching to renewable technologies very quickly, if we decentralize energy production, so we all have solar panels and we all have heat pumps and all that kind of stuff, and we can completely take out the production of fossil fuels, then that's the argument. The reality is that the technology isn't there and isn't proven yet, and even if it were, it'll take so much time to implement it. Secondly, emissions do not rise they continue rising after they've been put out. The temperatures, keep rising after the emissions have been put out. So even if we stop today in producing carbon, we would still see increases in temperatures up to 2080. So it's just, there's no real logic behind it. It's a comfortable argument to make, but I don't think it's a genuine one. And so we need significant decoupling, yes.
Sorry, Oliver. The other thing is that the assumption is we can carry on growing while reducing emissions, but that makes no sense.
Absolutely.
Because growth always produces emissions.
Yeah, exactly.
Doesn't matter where it is.
The theory is if you completely dematerialize the economy, as they say, not use any resources, reuse everything that's being made, have recycling. But of course, recycling uses energy. And how are we going to get food produced? That uses energy. How are we going to distribute it? How are we going to get access to it? So it's a flawed argument, but yet it's the one that everyone kind of talks about as we'll be okay because we've got this target, and targets will always be met. Maybe not. And this is not a new debate, by the way, this whole idea that GDP isn't quite capturing things. I'll read this out to you because it's probably a bit too far away, but this was a speech by Bobby Kennedy in 1968, right, over 50 years ago. And he made this speech and he said, and as I said, I'll read it out. So, too much and too long, we seem to have surrendered community excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product, which is very similar to GDP, not exactly the same, counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of our redwoods and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. It counts napalm, this was during the time of the Vietnam War, and the cost of a nuclear warhead, and armoured cars for police who fight riots in our streets. It counts Whitman's rifle and Speck's knife and the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. So all of these things that he's mentioned, they increase GDP. Wars increase GDP through the sale of arms. Accidents increase GDP. Fires increase GDP. So you've got to rebuild. And yet, the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debates, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And that's still true today. It's even more true today. So, we're clearly measuring the wrong things if we think that GDP is the way to get better outcomes for society, for people and planet. The other thing is that it doesn't actually achieve any real levels of well-being, in spite of that being the excuse. So you probably are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which talks about these are fundamental human needs. Physiological needs met, so kind of what our physical needs, you have to have food, access to clean air, to water, to sanitation, to shelter, etc. Our safety needs, this is about feeling secure, having a job, being healthy. Our love and belonging needs, friendship, intimacy, relationships. Our esteem needs, feeling respected, having self-esteem, belief in ourselves. And then self-actualization. So this is the desire to actually do something beyond what beyond your own capacities, serving others, for instance. I also like the way that Chilean economist Manfred Max Neef talks about it. So I'll read this out again. He talks about these different fundamental human needs: subsistence, protection, affection, understanding, participation, leisure, creation, identity, and freedom. Now, what Max Neef says, which I think is quite interesting, because these needs are universal. Every single person on the planet, wherever they live, and whatever time period they lived, whether it's in the caves in prehistoric times or today, had these same fundamental human needs. So in a way, we know that those are the needs that we need to meet. What Max Neef said in his research is that actually what changes is not the needs themselves, it's the way we satisfy those needs. It's how we go about finding ways to get those needs met. And there are different types of satisfiers. And he talks about destructive satisfiers all the way to kind of symbiotic satisfiers. In other words, satisfiers that meet different needs at the same time. So a destructive satisfier would be smoking, for instance. It satisfies a need maybe to take a break, to just relax for a bit. It might satisfy a need for companionship because you can then, create a smokers community and have friends within that. It might satisfy all of those needs, but ultimately it's destructive. Consumerism, shopping, is a negative satisfier. It temporarily makes us a little bit happier because we feel like, oh, I've got this thing now, this is going to make me happy. And then once you have the thing, you're happy for a day, and then you go back to what's the next thing. And then, the kind of the synergistic satisfiers are things. One example he uses is breastfeeding. So breastfeeding meets the need for nutrition of the child, the need for affection of the child, the need for affection of the mother, and the need and that kind of sense of self-actualization. So we need to look not at what our needs are. We need to look at how we meet them, and challenge the ways in which we meet these needs. Tim Jackson, who you may know of, he's written a great book on this topic, by the way, called Post-Growth. But he did a TED Talk, and he talks about consumering as being effectively a place in which people, us, borrow money we don't have to buy things we don't need, to make impressions that won't last on people we don't care about. I mean, it's quite succinctly put. And so we do need to ask ourselves that question, are we really meeting a fundamental need when we go shopping? And is it going to make us happier, more importantly? So the last critique is around this concept of kind of economic hegemony. So the idea that the only game in town is our current way of looking at our economy, the neoliberalist approach. The truth is there are loads of different economic theories. On one extreme, Marxism, on the other extreme, neoliberalism. And between that, there are loads of others. Keynesian economics, Austrian economics, etc., etc. I won't bore you with them. I don't even know half of them anyway. But the truth is we live in a world which tells us that this is the only game in town. It's only about neoliberalism. And George Monbiot said it quite succinctly. He says, it's become so pervasive that we don't even recognize it as an ideology. We think that this is the only way that we can run economies, neoliberalist principles. And it's, well, as I hope I've shown, pretty dangerous as an approach. So we need to open ourselves up to this different way of thinking. We need diversity in our economic thought. I mean, it got so bad that students of economics in the UK started protesting, saying, you can't just teach us one school of thought. We're here to study economics. We're not here to study neoliberalism. So we need that diversity of thought as well. So there are countries that have a much lower GDP per capita, because that's really the measure, is GDP per capita. These can be quite poor countries, obviously, because they just don't, have the energy needs that we have. They don't have multiple TVs, multiple cars, big homes, etc. One of the countries that actually did the best for a long time at achieving both human well-being, as measured in certain ways, and environmental, kind of minimizing the environmental footprint, was Cuba. Cuba went through a period when the Russian oil stopped being kind of given to them, where they had to find really creative ways of making food and getting around. So they bought loads of bicycles and they created loads of local agricultural schemes. Now, clearly Cuba is lacking in some other aspects, but the levels, so Cuba has a very good education system, it has a good healthcare system, so it ticked a lot of those boxes. It's no longer in that category, by the way. And then there are countries that do better because they've really thought about their industrial strategy and they've really thought about kind of making the shift. So, Norway is a country where people, you can barely buy a fossil fuel car anymore, a new car. It's all electric. The energy production, paradoxically, is very much renewables, even though their entire wealth is based on the sale of fossil fuels. So there are countries that do better. But there are countries, and the UK is certainly one of them, that kind of want to ignore the problem. So if we're looking at the inequality stats, it's typically the Scandinavian countries, kind of northwestern Europe, do well. They have a very high understanding of kind of social networks and dependencies. So Scandinavian countries are very happy to pay significant taxes. I think the top tax rate in Sweden is 80%. And people accept that because they know that that's the price they're willing to pay in order to have a society that functions well. And in order for their people, their children, their friends to have access to the things that make healthy societies. So I think there is certainly something there about that understanding of the social net with that sense of shared responsibility. One of the reasons I think the US is at the top is they are very much a me culture. I can become a success. I can do this. Nothing's going to stop me from doing great things. Whereas some of the countries down here are much more around collaboration, around the need and the interdependencies between people.
But the difference between Portugal and Spain is vast. And what is there something in their economy that's different, or?
Well, I have to admit, I was surprised by that as well. I was surprised because I always thought that Portugal had actually some really strong networks that supported that, but I don't know the detail behind that. And the other thing is also to say this was written about 10 years ago, so it may have changed now. But to the point about what you were saying earlier about people needing to kind of they're not at that place of understanding. I think one of the things that we need to do differently is we need to look at what we're communicating. So the government every quarter puts out a growth figure. In the last quarter, the economy has grown by X. And if that figure is 10%, everyone's going to be, yay, 10%, that's brilliant. What if on the same day, the government released a figure that says our well-being has dropped by 5%? Well, we'd still go, yay. But we don't, because we actually have access to the information. The Office of National Statistics has well-being indicators, but we don't publicize them. Also because they've put 42 indicators, and actually you need to summarize it into one ideally. But if we were able to do that, then the narrative would shift, the conversation would change, because people go, yeah, that's great that we've got growth, but we're unhappy. What's going on here? Right, let me move on to a few examples of alternative ways of looking at this, alternative measures of progress. This is quite a neat little thing that the OECD does. It's called the Better Life Index. You can just search for OECD Better Life Index. These are all the OECD countries, and these are 10 different indicators of a better life. So you've got housing, income, jobs, community, education, environment, civic engagement, health, life satisfaction, safety, and work-life balance. And what you can do with this is you've got these sliders here. You can move a slider to, so let's say you care more about education and jobs than anything else. You move the slider to the end, and this will shift. It'll start shifting because it'll tell you that those countries that are moving upwards are doing better on those criteria than others. So it's quite a neat way of figuring out how your country is doing and how it's doing compared to others. It's not comprehensive, and of course it doesn't cover the entire world. The Social Progress Index is slightly different. So that looks at defining social progress and how different countries are doing along those lines. So as you can see, the dark blue are good, so they're at the top end. So that's Canada, Northern Europe, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, and then the lighter it gets and the greener it gets, the worse they're doing. It's a really interesting analysis. Its only flaw is it only looks at the environment down here. So that's the only environmental aspect. The others are grouped into 3 categories: basic human needs, foundations of well-being or happiness, and opportunity, the opportunity to effectively kind of improve yourself in different ways. But it's quite good, and it has data for every country kind of in detail along all those indicators. I would argue that the foundations of well-being are eroded the better the wealth is. The challenge is the environmental piece. It's almost completely, so it doesn't take that into account at all. Right. A framework that kind of covers everything is the Sustainable Development Goals. I suspect many of you are familiar with this. So these are 17 different goals that the UN countries, 196 countries have signed up to these, have set to say this is what we want to achieve in terms of global development. I'll read them out. No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean access to water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation, infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice and strong institutions, and partnerships. Now, they cover a lot. And they do a pretty good job at saying this is actually what we need. And behind each of these goals are indicators. So you've got in total 168 indicators that you can, so if you want to know what do we need to do, say in Lewes, to achieve good health and well-being, you can look at those indicators and I will give you a sense of where we might start. The problem with it is, and you might have noticed this, that some of them are potentially in contradiction with each other. Right? So if we talk about industry, innovation, infrastructure, or decent work and economic growth, and climate action, they might not always go hand in hand. Or life on land, life on water, the impact on biodiversity. So they're really good as kind of a way to look at what's needed, but what ends up happening is countries, and particularly companies, and I do a lot of work with companies, they pick and choose the ones they're good at and ignore the ones they're not so good at, which doesn't really get you where you need to be. Very briefly, this is some work that I did about 10 years ago for an organization called the Aldersgate Group. The idea was to assess what is required for a healthy economy, an economy that works for everybody, and defining the core characteristics of such an economy. And so did a lot of engagement with business leaders, with civil society leaders, with politicians, with loads of different kind of civil society groups to come up with these core characteristics. And we came up with the following 6 ones. High levels of quality employment. So giving people access to jobs, but quality jobs. Equality of opportunity, so providing everyone with the same opportunities. Having well-being at the core, so ensuring that policy is focused on delivering well-being. Those are the 3 socioeconomic ones, and the environmental ones are low carbon, zero waste, and enhancing nature. So this is to address a lot of So this is kind of distilling, in a very simple way, what we need to look for. Ignore GDP. Let's not talk about GDP. GDP is irrelevant. There's a whole debate in academia and in post-growth economics about whether we should actively advocate for a degrowth model. We have to reduce the growth, or as a zero growth model. We have to keep growth as it is and not try to increase it. I would say I don't care. You can focus on whatever you like. As long as you deliver these things, I don't care if it comes with or without growth. Because also the other thing is that if you start talking about degrowth models, you're losing a big part of your audience. People, particularly in the capitalist mindset, will go, oh, no, you're just a liberal hippie, go away. Whereas if you say, listen, I don't care about growth, but can we focus on these, please? Then you get them engaged. If you ask most people in the UK, to your point, they will want to elect a government that promises economic growth, because that gives them a sense of security. So we're not talking at the next level, which is, why do you want economic growth? What's it going to do for you? Think about that. And there's a whole bunch of narratives that actually we don't question. It's the topic of a book that I'm researching now, which, one of those is humankind. We are all flawed. We're all greedy. We're all after number one at the expense of everyone else. That's a very powerful narrative in society today. The narrative that we have dominion over the earth. We are superior to the planet, therefore we can do to it what you want. And there are many, many more. Those need to be challenged, and we need to have a societal conversation about those, because if we don't, we're never going to shift the system. I think the way you can have the most impact is by looking at how your pensions are invested. Because, so those of us who have pensions from our employers, we get allocated a certain amount of money that gets put into our pension to a certain fund. 94% of us never ever change that fund, even though we all have the option to invest that money into a different fund. We never do. Now that's because we find it all too complicated. We don't know where to move it towards, because we're not informed about the fact that we can do it. There's also kind of a bit of psychology going on where you go, if I'm going to do something actively to move my money and something goes wrong, I've only got myself to blame. If I leave it where it is and something goes wrong, I can blame someone else. So there are all these reasons, but actually that is far more than not using plastic bags or buying an electric car. How you invest your money is going to have the most fundamental impact, because that will dictate, so you can invest your money into B Corps, you can invest your money into renewable energy, you have those choices, and it doesn't mean that you have to do the picking yourself. There are loads of funds out there who will do the choices for you. You've got to be careful, because sometimes those funds are just, the best of a bad bunch, and they're not that great, but there are some that are really good. So that I think is an important, an important step forward. Okay, I'll finish quickly with just a few examples. So one of those, by the way, is you talk about the circular economy and also the donut economy. So Amsterdam, the Netherlands have got loads of circular economy initiatives and really interesting businesses. So circular economy, for those who don't know, is our normal economic model is you take something out of the ground, you make a product, you sell the product, you use the product, you throw it away. And there's waste along every chain, both financial waste, by the way, economic waste, and physical waste. Circular economy says, let's just think more cleverly about how we use stuff. So if a product has been made and it's no longer useful for that person, can it be useful for someone else? Sharing models, etc. So it's all about reducing. Recycling is kind of the lowest rung of the circular economy. There's loads of other things you can do. So, and that happens that's really starting to come up now. The donut economic model is being championed by Amsterdam as their way of kind of redefining their own economic purpose. Then there are and there are loads of other examples. At the national level, you might have heard of gross national happiness in Bhutan. This is a concept that's been around for a very, very long time. They championed it. Now, Bhutan is a very small country, easier to manage in some ways, but they have a strong focus on happiness. So their idea is that within ecological sustainability, they want to achieve the preservation and promotion of a free and resilient culture, good governance and equality before the law, and sustainable and equitable socio-economic development. And that's part of their policy. But it's not just tiny countries like Bhutan. This is New Zealand, and this is the kind of the policy diagram of the Treasury in New Zealand. So the Ministry of Finance, effectively. So at that level, they're thinking about, okay, how can we improve our individual and collective well-being, our institutions and our governance, and the wealth of the country? Wealth defined as, yes, physical and financial physical capital, but also human capability, social cohesion, and the natural environment. So this is how they define their policies. And there are actually, or their words changed slightly. There were 4 countries in the world that had well-being as kind of the core policy driver. The 4 were Wales, Iceland, New Zealand, and Scotland. Now, the so-called WINS countries, as they were known. Now, of course, 2 of those aren't technically countries, but they still, if you look at Wales, for instance, they've got a minister for future generations. So someone who has a voice in government for future generations. Scotland have got loads of different initiatives. They've got a lot of regenerative things happening. What's interesting was that when those policies were developed, 3 of those 4 countries were led by women. And I do believe, I can say this as a Western white bloke, that a lot of the negative narratives that we have are Western white male narratives. They are narratives, you know, and which have helped us tremendously in terms of that level of ambition and progress and you know, discovery, which we tend. And by the way, this is not male or female. This is male versus female characteristics, and we should inhabit and exhibit all of those. But they tend to be more targeted in men, whereas the female characteristics of empathy, compassion, collaboration, love, dare I say, you know, we're lacking those at that level. And I think there is certainly a correlation on that. So that's the end, or is it the beginning of a new tomorrow? Thank you very much.